Now, do we want to be a future president? Or maybe a convicted war criminal? Perhaps we could be a fantasist, or maybe a dick, maybe a hero of the Soviet Union, or maybe 3 out of 4 doomed men. There's just so many choices. Hi, I'm Caliban, and today we're going to talk about Axis and Allies, a real-time strategy game from 2004. Axis and Allies was the creation of Timegate Studios and would be one of 2 RTS releases that they developed in parallel. They had a decent amount of success with their first strategy offering, a high fantasy game by the name of Kohan, released in 2001. Kohan was notable for using a logistics model that required matching supply with demand and featuring squads of soldiers rather than individual units. It was strongly praised by critics and sold pretty well, leading to the release of Kohan 2 3 years later. Using the same engine developed for Kohan 2, Timegate decided to work on another game set during the Second World War. Their staff were all interested in military history anyway, and they had put a lot of time into the creation of the game engine, so making a second game set during that period made a lot of sense. They were also fans of the board game Axis and Allies, so an official deal was struck and they were allowed to base aspects of their new project on elements of the board game and release it under the same name. Both Kohan 2 and Axis and Allies were reasonably successful for Timegate. Kohan 2 received a bit more praise than Axis and Allies, but the latter did better on the sales front. However, I don't think you can really describe either title as a smash hit. 2003 to 2004 would see some pretty big RTS releases, including the Frozen Throne expansion for Warcraft 3, Command & Conquer Generals, Rise of Nations and Dawn of War, and in that sort of landscape, pretty good isn't often enough to make your mark. These 2 games would be the last strategy titles we'd get from Timegate. They would then go on to make 3 expansions for the first-person shooter Fear, a horror FPS crossover released in 2005. This would be the last time that Timegate would find any sort of success. Their next game was a shooter of their own creation called Section 8, which wasn't a bad game, but it also wasn't hugely successful. Their final offering was Aliens Colonial Marines, a highly anticipated game that is regarded as one of gaming's most notable and abject failures. The predictable followed: layoffs, lawsuits, and finally Chapter 7 bankruptcy in 2013. But let's rewind the clock a little and go back to 2004 and take a look at their most successful game. The first thing that struck me about Axis and Allies was the amount of content included. Due to the parallel development and the tie-ins to the board game, I was expecting to find a half-hearted release that was designed to cash in on the popularity of the IP and the work already created for Kohan 2. It was pretty clear to me that Kohan was very much the prime focus due to the success of the first game, and because of that I was concerned that they might have taken a very quick and dirty approach to Axis and Allies. However, this is very much not the case. It has a total of 5 playable factions, each with its own selection of 4 generals who are all voiced and animated. There are 2 full single-player campaigns, one focused on each coalition, as well as a dynamic World War campaign that is obviously inspired by the board game. Most games of this period generally included one of these 2 sorts of campaigns, so it's quite impressive that Axis and Allies decided to include both. On top of this, there's support for single-player skirmishes and multiplayer matches, both which include the possibility of either using preset or randomly generated maps. The standard single-player campaigns each consist of a set of 12 missions. For the Allies, these recreate famous battles such as Second El Alamein and the Stalingrad counteroffensive. For the Axis, most of these are alternative history scenarios, based on a selection of dubious what-ifs such as the invasion of Australia and Operation Sea Lion. These missions open with a small in-engine cutscene and then present a highly scripted and detailed scenario. There isn't really much of a thread that connects them, so it can be a bit jarring jumping from North Africa to the Pacific and then from Russia to France, but there's only so much continuity you can create when covering a huge period of history in a relatively short campaign. The missions themselves are pretty enjoyable once you start to understand them, but the game does have a habit of throwing you in at the deep end and it can be a little disorientating before you really get going. Now, there isn't anything exactly wrong with this campaign, although I think I would have been a little disappointed if it was the only single player mode available. Because of the disjointed nature, they feel a little more like the extra mission add-on packs that used to be a feature of many games in the late 90s and the early 2000s, rather than a single cohesive experience with a satisfying conclusion. The World War campaign is what I assume is generally supposed to be the main single-player offering, as it's clearly based on the board game that shares the name. I think the best way to describe it to the uninitiated is like a more complicated version of Risk. You pick a nation, and then you're presented with a world map divided into territories. Each of the 5 players starts with a capital and a handful of other territories and some game pieces that represent your armies. Each turn you receive a small amount of income, and then you can spend that on recruiting new armies or upgrading existing ones, and then you can move any or all of your pieces into neighbouring territories to capture them. You can also make a single attack action each turn by moving one of your armies into a territory occupied by an opposing army. This then results in an RTS battle used to decide the outcome of the engagement. The more armies you have in a region, the better start you get in your RTS battle, and the strength of those armies determines the level of technologies available to you. If you win the battle, you then occupy that territory, destroy your opponent's weakest army and then force the others to retreat. If you lose, then your own weakest army is destroyed and the rest of your forces retreat. After you take your turn, the computer takes the turns for the 4 other nations, where you can either quick resolve battles or watch the AI opponents go head to head. Overall victory is achieved when one of the 2 coalitions occupies 2 of the opposition's capitals. The RTS engine itself is very different from anything else I've played, and it handles recruitment, resupply and resources in a way that I've not seen in more recent games. The gamer in me really enjoyed getting to grips with something a little unusual, and the military history buff in me really liked how armies were represented. During the game you got to juggle 3 resources: money, ammo and fuel. The first of these is a little akin to a more regular resource. There is a slow continual increase and it's used to purchase new buildings and units. You can increase the generation rate by capturing various towns that are present around the map and by creating production structures. Ammo and fuel work a little differently. It's not something you can save up, but it's closely related to the amount of units and defensive structures that you can support. If your army's upkeep requirements outstrip the amount of ammo and fuel you can provide, then the excess is deducted from your financial income. Small deficits aren't a problem, but large ones will cripple your economy and severely limit your ability to raise new units and research upgrades. Think of them a bit like soft unit caps that incur penalties if they're breached, limits which can be increased by spending your money on oil trucks and ammo dumps. Now that's covered, let's say we want some units. First, we need to raise a new division, so we build a divisional HQ from our core HQ building. This costs money and arrives in the form of a truck that we can drive around and then deploy at a suitable location. There are 3 types of divisional HQs we can raise: infantry, mechanised and armoured. The latter 2 require some upgrades, so we'll start with the infantry division. Now this is deployed, we can see it's got 5 slots. It's not always 5, depending on the type of division and your nationality the number will vary, but it's generally in the region of 5. This allows us to deploy and support a total of 5 infantry regiments. Because we've got no upgrades, we're only able to raise recon and regular infantry regiments, so we click an option. After a short bit of production time, our regiment arrives. But it does not arrive fully formed and instead only includes the regimental headquarters. As long as the regiment stays within your zone of supply, which extends in a radius from your buildings and any captured towns, it will slowly reinforce until it is up to full strength. This is shown by adding models to the regiment both in the game area and in the unit details section at the bottom of the screen. This is somewhat representative. A light infantry regiment will consist of 7 or 8 regular infantry models and 1 or 2 of machine guns. An AA regiment will have some soldiers plus some mobile anti-aircraft guns, and a motorised regiment will have a mixture of half-tracks and armoured cars. When your regiment takes damage in battle, some of the individual elements will lose health and then be removed. You can then reinforce it by moving it back to your supply zone, and those missing units will be replenished automatically and without cost. As long as the unit isn't completely destroyed, reinforcement is free and therefore your supply zone is very important. You can use supply trucks to extend this zone to a larger area, or you can create corridors between your main base and any area you hope to be fighting in. This is of huge advantage to you, as it gives your units a nearby area to retreat and heal up so you can send them back into the fray. Maintaining and protecting this zone of supply is of critical importance, and if the enemy gets behind you and manages to cut you off, then an otherwise advantageous position can swiftly turn very sour. You can manually retreat units, and sometimes they will rout of their own accord, but as long as you have other units to keep the enemy engaged, then you can normally manage to retreat them far enough back to keep them alive. This is why the supply zone has such an impact. If you're fighting close to your own lines and the enemy are some distance from theirs, then you can wear them down even if they are numerically superior. If you want to recruit more units, you can just build more divisional HQs, and then you can use those to raise new regiments and deploy them into battle. Your core HQ can also build support structures, the engineering depot, the motor pool and the artillery depot. These increase the options from each divisional HQ and allowed you to build the motorised and armoured divisions so you can access the most mobile and the most powerful units available. There are also a couple of specialist HQs, including the airborne HQ that allows you to parachute infantry onto the battle map, and the airfield truck that allows you to use bombers to smash the enemy and fighters to either escort your bombers or intercept the enemy ones. It does cost some cash to send your bombers on a mission, but if your enemy has poor air defences, then it's very much worth it. There are also a selection of regular upgrades, improved damage, improved speed, protection and that sort of thing. And there are of course engineer regiments that can conduct repairs, construct bunkers, AA guns and artillery emplacements. These static defences are very good at delaying the enemy and give you time to move your own forces into position for a counterattack. When you need to do a big relocation, you can set your regiments to column formation, where they'll trade attack power for speed. And then when you know they're going to get into a fight, you can use the assault formation to trade their speed for more combat power. Once the game gets going, it's a pretty back and forth system. You'll fight over the neutral towns as the extra income and supply zone they provide makes a big difference, and front lines will be established and move back and forward as your regiments are forced to retreat and then regroup and counterattack. There is plenty of opportunity to engage in a bit of strategic thinking by attempting to cut off supply lines or outflank the enemy. There is no special damage bonus to flanking attacks, but they do allow you to block the path of a retreating enemy and create a very advantageous position where you can completely destroy the enemy regiments and force your opponent to spend money on replacing them. These are some really interesting systems with quite a lot of depth, variety and tactical options. Because you're controlling regiments rather than individual soldiers, and because those units don't really have much in the way of activatable abilities, there isn't a huge amount of micromanagement required. You tell your regiments to engage the enemy and they just get on with it, and if you tell them to do nothing, they'll automatically dig in for a defensive bonus. And if they're attacked, they'll automatically fight back with full force. They'll also automatically retreat when their morale's low as a result of taking too much damage. This makes Axis and Allies feel very different from a lot of other real-time strategy games. It manages to provide a real-time experience that's high on strategy and low on micro, something that few other games attempt and even fewer succeed. I think in the multiplayer games this probably led to some very engaging battles that had a lot of to and fro and catered for a lot of diverse playstyles and strategies. Unfortunately for the single player, there is one huge problem that really limits enjoyment in this area. The AI is so completely and fundamentally flawed that the only way it can win is if you actively allow it to. This was a great disappointment to me, as before I played the game I was doing a bit of research and ended up watching some of the old marketing media that was released in the run-up to the game. This is a quote from Ian Killimon, the producer at Timegate Studios. "The Battlefield AI system is a non-cheating, non-scripted learning AI. The AI will actually learn and adapt to player strategies as they play the game." Now, I can't tell you if this is a barefaced lie or not. Perhaps the AI has some capacity to learn and adapt, but at the base level it is very, very stupid. The problems here appear to be twofold. Firstly, the AI over-prioritizes upgrades over units in the early game. And secondly, it does not understand the importance of holding the towns and cities and the best way to do that. This replay here is enigmatic of how the AI will perform in pretty much all of the World War campaign and the skirmishes. Just like me, it will open up with an infantry division HQ. I'll immediately produce 2 recon regiments and 3 infantry regiments, and then I'll spread them out and send them to capture all of the towns. The AI will produce some infantry divisions and then send a group of them to capture a town that is in the opposite direction of my forces. It will then spend the remainder of its money on upgrades and later build a couple more infantry regiments. Because I haven't purchased these low impact upgrades, I'll soon have enough money to get a 2nd divisional HQ. That will allow me to build more units but also increase my passive income. If I run into an enemy regiment that I can't beat in a fight, I'll just circle around it and capture the town that they just left. By the time we're 5 or 10 minutes into the game, I'll have 2 divisional HQs and most of the towns, giving me an income of around 150. On the other side, the AI will have an income of around 30 or 40. This puts me at such a huge material advantage that I'll soon be fielding twice as many regiments and still have room for upgrades and other expansion. It will take me a little while to win, as you've got to chase down all of those individual units and destroy them and then pick away at their base, but there'll never be any doubt as to the outcome. The whole endgame process is just an exercise in frustration, as you've got to chase down and kill every last remaining unit even when you have destroyed all of their production structures and you outnumber them 10 to 1. Now, it's not like I'm doing anything crazy here or using some sort of cheesy rush tactic that I learned from a grandmaster. I'm just spending my starting funds on basic infantry and using them to secure resource locations, which is just basic game sense. The AI will always do this badly and always invest in tech that it has little use for. It's not like the difficulty setting makes any difference. You can put the AI on hard and give it a 25% resource boost, but 25% on top of 30 is still nothing compared to the 150 I'll be earning. The only way I can lose is if I essentially sit on my hands for the first 5 or 10 minutes and let the AI take the lead. This isn't because I've got hours and hours of experience with the game, it's something I realised after about 3 skirmish matches. The real tragedy of this shortcoming is how it completely wrecks the World War campaign. Even if the odds are stacked heavily in your enemy's favour, you can win most battles by just using the same principles. Sure, the AI's large advanced strategic army pieces might give them access to tanks and planes in the late game of the RTS battles, and you might just have guys with guns, but the AI performs so poorly in the opening phases that by the time you see a tank you're already smashing their base with 3 divisions of infantry. The poor AI decision making also extends to the world map. It will again prioritise upgrades over army pieces, which severely limits its ability to capture and hold multiple territories and therefore greatly restricts its income. Now, it wouldn't be fair to criticise a lot of elements of Axis and Allies from a modern perspective. However, I feel like these AI problems are something that probably could have been ironed out at the time, and they are surely something that must have become apparent during testing. Because they all stem from a clear and defined problem about how the AI approaches the early game, I don't think it would even need that much work to fix, just a small change in its early game decision making and prioritization. Maybe Timegate did create a learning AI just as they stated in their promo video, but I'm guessing if this is the case, then that learning AI was taught by an idiot. All of the other aspects of the game are perfectly suitable for the period it was released. The graphics are blocky and the texture's basic, but by 2004 standards they're not too bad. Bigger studios were getting better results, and if you stack Axis and Allies up against something like CNC Generals from the previous year, then it's clear that they aren't exactly cutting edge, but from an independent studio with a far smaller budget, then I think they are certainly acceptable. The voice acting, the effects and the soundtrack are of a similar level of quality. Not bad for the time, but also nothing to write home about either. If this was a major release from a top dollar studio, I would have expected better, but from a more modest outfit, I think it's fair to say they are sufficient, competent even, and although they don't do too much to enhance the gameplay, they also don't detract from it either. One nice little bonus for me was how easy it was to get the game running. Sometimes these older products that haven't had a modern digital release can be a complete nightmare, but this one was an absolute piece of cake. I installed the game from the original physical media, entered my product key, and then it launched straight away without a single issue. It even supported 2K widescreen straight out of the box without any need for patches, mods or config tweaks. I have heard that there can be problems with crashing on modern systems, but it's not something that I've experienced. I was also quite happy to see some additional features. The game does include the ability to save and watch replays of any of your previous games via a feature lovingly labelled Films. The replay system doesn't support time skipping or rewinding, but it does exist, which is a real bonus and is a feature that many older games just didn't support. It also includes a map and scenario creator, which is pretty straightforward to use and also has a great amount of flexibility. I think it's powerful enough that you could easily create missions of the same detail as the ones featured in the campaign, and I assume that they were all probably made with this same tool. It's far more than a map maker. You can create objectives and set up a complex set of triggers and interactions to add detailed scripted events to your missions. I suspect that this sort of functionality is probably the game's saviour when it comes to replayability, as by creating your own scenarios and sharing them between your friends, you can easily overcome the problems with the skirmish and World War AI. It would probably also let you create some pretty funky co-op challenges, all very good stuff. I find myself in a continual state of almost impressed when it comes to Axis and Allies. There is so much that the game does well, so many different ideas and so many ways to play that these positives easily outweigh the negatives of the unimpressive sound design and the slightly subpar graphics. I love the divisional recruitment system, and I think it's about the only base building RTS I've played that comes close to properly representing how military units are organised. The supply system works perfectly for this sort of game, and it not only encourages good map control but actively rewards you for objectives other than a direct attack on your enemy's base of operations. There's a lot of variety when it comes to the different regiments you can raise, and the buildings and management of your base is way more than an afterthought. The various generals you can play all include their own set of special abilities that gel well with a large assortment of tactics and unit compositions. It's also really nice to see a real-time strategy game that decides to be less micro-focused. These games are great, but there was already enough of them on the market in 2004, and it's nice to have something a bit different available. Axis and Allies manages to walk a fine line between the types of play you experience in real-time and turn-based games. However, the whole experience is seriously let down by the problems with the opposition AI. This is a big shame to me, and I think if this was a little different, then I'd probably have sunk quite a bit of time into this game. Non-cheating AI in early real-time strategy games was never much to write home about, but the use of carefully scripted campaigns in these games went a long way to offsetting the inherent problems. Unfortunately, in Axis and Allies, the skirmish AI is the backbone of the World War campaign mode, probably the game's primary selling point, as it's what connects the release to the board game that inspired it. That critical flaw makes this whole mode rather trivial, and it's very easy to complete the campaign in a relatively low number of turns by just winning almost every battle, even if the odds on paper dictate that you should probably lose. Overall, Axis and Allies is still a pretty solid release for 2004, and I think if you were primarily focused on the multiplayer and co-op, or used a lot of custom scenarios, then the game is much more impressive. As an out-of-the-box single-player experience, it's slightly disappointing. This is a shame, as I think it actually had the potential to offer quite a lot more.
I wish I'd thought of that. Come to attention, lads. For king and country.
Hi there, thanks for sitting through this little look back at Axis and Allies. If you enjoyed this video, then click the like button, and I'd love to hear your experiences with the game, so please share them in a comment or on the Discord. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back soon.